Silas Ashcroft took one look at the woman stepping off the train and turned his back on her before she reached the bottom step. Not a word. Not even the decency of an excuse. He just looked at Beatrice Holloway, all of her, every curve, every inch of the body she'd carried through 31 years of harder living than Silas Ashcroft had ever known, and he walked away. Right there on the platform in front of half the town of Cartwell, Wyoming, he shoved his hands in his coat pockets and walked away like she was freight that had arrived damaged. Beatrice stood holding her one traveling bag, the cold wind cutting through her wool coat, and she did not cry. She stood perfectly still and watched him go. Standing at the far end of the platform, his shoulder pressed against a support post, Gideon Ashcroft had watched every second of it, and something shifted in his chest that he hadn't felt move in years. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Because what Gideon does in the next few minutes is going to change everything for both of them. The morning had started cold, the way October mornings in Wyoming always did, mean and indifferent, with a sky the color of old pewter pressing down over the mountains. Gideon had come to Cartwell for supplies, nothing more. Flour, lamp oil, a new axe handle to replace the one he'd cracked splitting hardwood the week before. He hadn't planned to be standing on the train platform at all, but his brother had asked him to come, said he wanted family present when his bride arrived, said it might help her feel welcome in a new place. Gideon had almost said no. He and Silas didn't spend time together by choice anymore, not since their father's land had been divided 3 years back, and the division had gone the way Silas wanted and not the way that was fair. But Silas had asked, and Gideon wasn't the kind of man who refused a request without a reason he could say out loud, so he'd ridden down from the mountain before sunrise and tied his horse outside the general store and walked over to the platform with a cup of bad coffee in his hand. He'd been standing there half an hour when the train pulled in. Silas was dressed up. That was the first thing Gideon noticed. His brother had on his good coat and his hat with the brim brushed clean, and he was standing with his chest out the way he did when he wanted people to see him a certain way. There were maybe 20 people on the platform, a mix of townspeople and a few ranchers who'd come in for market day, and Silas was aware of all of them. He was always aware of all of them. The passengers came off the train in ones and twos, a family with 3 young children, a traveling salesman with a case that was too heavy for one man, an older couple who moved slowly and held on to each other on the steps. Then she came. Beatrice Holloway came off that train. The way a woman comes off a train when she's been traveling for 4 days and hasn't slept well, and is trying not to let any of it show on her face. She was tall, taller than Gideon had expected from the way Silas had described the advertisement, which was to say Silas had described nothing useful, only that the agency had sent a photograph and she looked agreeable. She had dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, a wool coat that had been mended at one elbow, and she carried her bag herself without looking around to see if someone was going to take it from her. She'd already decided nobody would. She was a big woman. There was no other way to say it, and Gideon wasn't the kind of man who looked for softer words when plain ones were accurate. She was broad through the shoulders and heavy through the middle, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed and not apologize for it. Her face was plain but not unpleasant, with dark eyes that moved quickly over the platform, reading it the way a person reads a room they've just walked into, looking for the exit before they look for the welcome. Those eyes found Silas. Gideon watched his brother's face. It happened fast. Silas looked at her, really looked, the way a man looks when he's measuring against an expectation, and something in his expression just folded. Not dramatically, not with any of the cruelty you'd expect if you were writing it in a story. It was worse than that. It was dismissal, pure, quiet, complete dismissal, the kind that said she had never been a person to him, only an image, and the image hadn't matched, so the person didn't count. Silas turned around. He walked off the platform. He didn't look back. Beatrice had seen it. Of course she'd seen it. She'd been watching him the whole time, and she'd seen his face change, and she'd seen him turn, and she stood there holding her bag with both hands, and watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner of the depot building. The platform went quiet in that particular way that a crowd goes quiet when everyone has witnessed something they wish they hadn't. A few people looked away. A woman near the far end of the platform whispered something to her husband. The station master, an older man named Pruitt, who'd worked that platform for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything, suddenly became very interested in his clipboard. Beatrice didn't move. Gideon set down his coffee cup on the post beside him and walked toward her. He didn't have a plan. He wasn't the kind of man who moved through the world with plans for situations like this, because situations like this weren't supposed to exist, weren't supposed to be things that happened to real people on real platforms in front of real witnesses. But he was walking toward her before he'd decided to, and then he was standing in front of her, and she was looking at him with those quick dark eyes, and he realized he had no idea what he was going to say. "Beatrice Holloway," he said. "Yes." Her voice was level, not shaking, not brittle, just level, like she was answering a clerk's question. "I'm Gideon, Silas's brother." He stopped there because saying more seemed like it would make things worse, and making things worse was the one outcome he was sure he wanted to avoid. She studied him for a moment. "He's not coming back, is he?" It wasn't really a question. She already knew. Gideon answered it anyway because she deserved a straight answer, and not the kind of soft, fumbling, non-answer people gave when they were more interested in their own comfort than in someone else's reality. "No," he said. "I don't think he is." She nodded once, just once, the way you nod when a door closes and you'd been half expecting it to close and now you have to figure out what's on the other side of it. "I sold everything," she said. Not to him exactly. Not to anyone. Just out into the cold air of that platform, because some things need to be said even when there's no one adequate to hear them. "I sold my furniture and my sewing machine and my mother's kitchen table. I bought a one-way ticket." Gideon felt something shift behind his ribs again. "Where are you from?" "Ohio, outside of Columbus." She finally looked directly at him, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't grief and wasn't anger and wasn't quite either one. It was the look of a person who has used up a certain kind of feeling and arrived somewhere past it. "I have $11.40, and apparently no husband." He didn't say he was sorry. He almost did, but he stopped himself because he'd heard sorry his whole life, and it was the most useless word in the English language, just a sound people made to fill space when they couldn't do anything useful. Instead, he stood there and looked at her, and she stood there and looked at him, and the platform slowly started filling with regular noise again as people remembered they had places to be. "Do you know how to work?" Gideon asked. She blinked. It wasn't the question she'd been expecting. "What?" "Work, hard work. The kind that doesn't stop because it's cold or because you're tired." She looked at him like he might be dangerous or stupid, and he understood that because it was a strange question to ask a woman who was standing on a train platform with $11 and no husband and nowhere to go. But he asked it anyway. "I've been working since I was 7 years old," she said. "I don't know any other kind." He nodded. He looked at her bag, then at her face, then back at her bag. "I live up in the mountains, 40 minutes by horse, more if the trail's bad. I've got a cabin, a wood stove, about 800 acres of timber lease, and a winter coming in that's going to be bad. I can feel it." He paused. "I need a partner more than I need most things." Beatrice stared at him. "You don't know me." "I know what I just watched you do. You watched me get abandoned on a train platform. I watched you not fall apart." He said it plainly, without kindness that would have felt like pity, and without drama that would have felt false. "There are men I've worked with who would have gone to pieces over less. You're still standing, you're still thinking, you've got your bag in your hands and your eyes are already looking for the next thing." He paused. "That's what I need. That's worth more than pretty to me." She was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the platform had almost emptied. The train was beginning to build steam again, preparing to continue west. The station master had gone inside. The crowd that had witnessed Silas's performance had drifted away, back to their errands and their gossip and their own concerns. "You're talking about marriage," she said. "I am." "You want to marry a woman you met 3 minutes ago?" "2, he said. "I've been out here a while." For the first time, just barely, just at the corners, she almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it almost did. "I'm not a small woman," she said, and she said it flat and straight, the way you say the truest thing you have to say to someone before you get into anything with them, because better to say it now than to watch it become a problem later. "I noticed," he said. "The roof of my cabin needs someone who can stand against wind and not blow off. My woodpile needs someone strong enough to swing an axe for 4 hours without stopping. My pack horse needs someone heavy enough to balance a loaded sled on a downhill trail. He held her gaze. None of those problems are solved by small. She breathed out. Something in her shoulders released just slightly, like a rope being let out a single loop. She hadn't known she'd been holding herself that rigid, but she had been. "You're serious," she said. "I don't joke about winter," he said. "I've almost not made it through one. I won't survive another one alone." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He wasn't going to rush her, wasn't going to persuade her with anything beyond the truth, because if she came with him, she needed to come with the truth, and not something softer that would rot out from underneath them when the cold really hit. "You don't find me—" She stopped, started again. "Your brother found me." "My brother is a fool," Gideon said. "Has been his whole life. I stopped being embarrassed by it a while ago." That almost smile came back. Still didn't quite make it. "I'd want my own room," she said. "Cabin's got a sleeping loft and a main room. You can take the loft. I'll stay down." "I'd want to know what the arrangement is." "What's expected?" "Partnership," he said. "Equal work, equal say, equal share of whatever we build. We do this legal, right now, before we go anywhere, so you've got your name on the deed and you're not depending on my goodwill." He paused. "I've got a lawyer in town. Prewitt at the depot knows where to find him." She stood very still. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" He thought about it honestly before he answered. He owed her that, honesty, even if it wasn't flattering to himself. "Because I watched what my brother just did to you, and I've been watching him do things like that my whole life, and I'm tired of just watching. And because winter's coming and I need help and you need somewhere to be, and sometimes those two things match up for reasons that don't need to be prettier than they are." He paused. "And because you didn't cry." She looked at him. "Other women might have cried," he said. "I don't mean that as a judgment. It would have been the reasonable thing to do, but you didn't. And I need to know the person I'm going into winter with won't fall apart the first time the mountain does something terrible." Beatrice Holloway looked down at her bag. She looked at the train, now beginning its slow lurch forward. She looked at the mountains to the west, gray-blue and enormous, with the first permanent snow already sitting on the upper ridges. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right?" "All right, I'll marry you." She looked at him directly. "But I want to speak to this lawyer myself. Alone before I sign anything." "Good," he said. "That's exactly what I'd want you to do." They found Judge Halbert, who also served as Cartwell's only practicing attorney, at his office above the hardware store. I was a small, careful man who had seen enough of the frontier to find very little surprising, but even he paused when Gideon walked in with a woman he'd never seen before and said they wanted to draw up a marriage contract. Beatrice asked for 20 minutes alone with the judge. Gideon waited on the landing outside the door and listened to the low murmur of her voice through the wood, asking questions he couldn't quite make out. When she came back out, she had a folded piece of paper in her hand and her eyes were clearer than they'd been on the platform. "He says it's solid," she told Gideon. "My name on the property, equal dissolution rights if it doesn't work, no inheritance claim against me for debts incurred before the marriage." She paused. "He also said you're known as a fair man." "He's being generous," Gideon said. "He didn't sound like he was." They were married 20 minutes later in the judge's office, with Prewitt the station master as witness because he happened to be coming up the stairs when they needed one. There were no flowers and no ceremony beyond what the law required. Beatrice signed her name in clear, careful letters. She had good handwriting, he noticed, the handwriting of someone who'd worked at it. And then it was done. Outside on the street, they stood next to each other in the cold, and neither of them quite knew what to say. The afternoon was getting old, the light going golden and thin, and they had 40 minutes of riding ahead of them before the trail got dark. "I'll get my horse," he said. "I'll need to ride behind you," she said. "I didn't see a livery." "There's one on the south end of Maine, but you're right. It's easier to take you up the same horse for today. It's a strong animal." He glanced at her. "Big enough." She caught the implication and accepted it without offense, because he'd said it without contempt, and she was already learning to hear the difference. He got his horse, a rangy blue roan named Fletcher, 15 hands and built like a box, and brought him around to the mounting block in front of the general store. Gideon went up first and she came up behind him without asking for help, which he noted because the step was high and the horse was tall and most people would have asked. She settled behind him with her bag across her lap and her hands. He felt this, not saw it, placed carefully at his sides, not quite holding on, not quite not holding on. They left Cartwell as the sun touched the western ridge. Behind them, in the Yellow Lantern Saloon, Silas Ashcroft was on his third whiskey and telling anyone who'd listened that the mail-order agency had sent him damaged goods. Nobody in the saloon thought much of it. Nobody said anything to his face. But a few of them, the ones who'd been on the platform that morning, remembered what they'd seen and didn't quite feel the way they were supposed to feel when a man talked about a woman like that. The trail up to Gideon's land wound through pine and aspen, gaining elevation steadily, the air getting colder with every quarter mile. The horse moved well under double weight, picking its footing carefully on the rocky sections. Neither Gideon nor Beatrice talked much for the first 20 minutes. There was too much to sort through, and the trail required attention, and sometimes silence was just the practical thing. Then she said, behind him, "You said you almost didn't make it through a winter once." 2 years ago, he said. "Broke my leg in December, right femur. Set it myself with a pine splint and about half a bottle of rye whiskey." "How?" "Slipped coming off the roof after a snow load. Stupid mistake." He paused. "I'd had a bad week and I was rushing." "Were you alone?" "Always been alone up there," he said. "That was the problem." She was quiet for a moment. The horse stepped around a fallen branch and she leaned with it without being told to, adjusting her weight naturally. "I nursed my father through 2 winters when he was sick," she said. "Pneumonia the first time, something wrong with his heart the second. Our nearest neighbor was 3 miles. I learned to do what needed doing." "How old were you?" 19 and 21. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What happened to him?" "He made it through both winters. Died in June, a warm day. He was sitting in his chair and he just stopped." She said it simply, without performance. "He was a good man, hard, but fair. The hard and fair kind are the ones you miss." Gideon thought about his own father, who had also been hard, but whose fairness had been more complicated and less reliable. He didn't say that. Instead, he said, "You know anything about wood stoves?" "What kind?" "Cast iron, 4-plate. The baffle's been cracked since August, and I've been managing it, but it needs to be replaced before deep winter, or we'll lose all our heat draw." "I've worked on cast iron," she said. "You'll need a new plate, or you'll need to seal it with stove cement. Depends how bad the crack is." "It's bad," he said. "I've been packing it with ash paste, but it's a patch job." "Then you need a new plate." She paused. "Is there a hardware man in Cartwell who carries them?" "Dalrymple's, on the south end. He might have one. If not, I'd have to order from Cheyenne, and that's 6 weeks." "We should go back tomorrow and check, Check, she said, "before the trail gets worse." He nodded, and the horse climbed, and the mountains came in around them on both sides, dark and enormous, and completely indifferent to the 2 people making their way up through the last of the evening light. There was something almost restful about that indifference. The mountain didn't care who Silas Ashcroft thought she was. The mountain didn't care what she looked like, or how much space she took up, or what kind of woman the world had decided she was supposed to be. The mountain would try to kill them both equally. That was its own kind of fairness. The cabin came into view just as the last light was dying. A solid, low structure of notched logs with a stone chimney and 2 small windows and a porch that was stacked 3 rows deep with split wood on both sides of the door. It was not pretty. It was built to survive, which was different, and to Beatrice's eye, the difference was immediately clear and immediately interesting. "You built this yourself?" she asked as they dismounted. "Most of it. Bought the original structure with the land, added the back wall and the root cellar." He was already loosening the horse's cinch. "The root cellar's what saved me the winter I broke my leg. Everything was down there. I didn't have to go far." She walked up to the porch and looked at the wood stacks. She ran her hand along the top row, checking the split. Clean, even, good diameter for long burn. She looked at the stacking pattern, tight and stable with good airflow. "You stack well," she said. 20 years of practice." "My father used to say you could tell everything about a man's character by how he stacked his wood." She turned and looked at the cabin. He meant it as a compliment or an insult depending on the man. Gideon put the horse in the small paddock behind the cabin and came back to find her on the porch, not waiting for him to open the door, which he'd half expected, but examining the door hinge which had worked loose from the frame and was pulling at the wood. This hinge needs resetting, she said. It's on my list, he said. What's on your list? He almost smiled. It happened so rarely that his face wasn't entirely sure how to do it. How much time do you have? 8 months until spring, she said. Give or take. He opened the door. It stuck slightly at the bottom, another item on the list. And she walked in ahead of him, and she stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it all with those quick, reading eyes. The rough plank floor, the table and 2 chairs, the cast-iron stove against the north wall with its cracked baffle plate. The shelves along the east wall holding flour and salt and oil and dried beans and smoked meat. The sleeping loft above, accessed by a steep wooden ladder. The window on the south wall, small but placed right to catch the afternoon light. It's workable, she said. Highest compliment I've ever heard, he said, and this time the almost smile actually made it somewhere. She set her bag down on the table. She took off her hat and her coat and hung them on the peg beside the door. She'd noticed the peg immediately. That was how her eyes worked. They found the useful things, and she rolled up the sleeves of her dress and said, "What needs doing tonight?" He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, quiet and steady, settling on the roof and the wood stacks and the porch and the mountains, covering everything evenly the way the first snow always did, impartial and thorough, the way the mountain had always been. Fire first, he said. The stove needs banking differently at night. I'll show you the way I do it. Then we should check what we've got in the cellar against what the trip to town cost me today, figure out what we still need. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we go to Dalrymple's for the stoveplate. Then I need to check the south fence line. There's been elk pushing through it all week. And the roof. He looked up at the ceiling, listening to the snow settle. The roof might need some attention depending on how this storm builds. Beatrice rolled up her other sleeve. Then we'd better eat something first, she said. What have you got? He went to the shelves and started naming what was there, and she listened and started thinking out loud about what could be made from it. And they talked across each other the way 2 practical people talk when there's work to be organized, and neither of them needs to be in charge of the conversation, just in it together. It wasn't comfortable, exactly. They were strangers, and the strangeness was real, and they both felt it, but it was functional. It was real. And real, Gideon had learned at great cost, was worth more than comfortable. He'd been alone for 6 years on this mountain, not lonely in the way people expected, not sitting in the dark pining for company, but alone in the way that grinds you down slowly, the way a river grinds stone, so gradually you don't notice what's been worn away. Until one winter you crack a bone and have to lie on the floor for 2 weeks eating cold biscuits, and you understand that there are things a person cannot sustain alone no matter how capable they are. He hadn't known what he needed until he'd seen what Silas threw away. Beatrice found the skillet without being told where it was. She just looked at the shelves, decided where a person would logically put a skillet in a cabin this size, and went to the right peg. She found the salt. She found the fat. She started cooking with the ease of someone who had cooked in strange kitchens before, and knew that a kitchen is a kitchen, and the logic of it doesn't change much from one to the next. He set the table. He couldn't remember the last time he'd set it for 2. The snow kept falling outside. The stove put out heat through its cracked baffle, imperfect but sufficient. They ate across from each other at the rough table, and the food was simple. Fried salt pork and day-old cornbread that she'd found in the tin and heated against the stove side. And it was one of the stranger meals Gideon had ever eaten, sitting across from a woman he'd married 4 hours ago who was still measuring him, and who he was still measuring in return. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Your brother. The way you talked about him. It's not new, what he did today. The cruelty of it." It wasn't a question. Gideon chewed, thought, set down his fork. He's always needed things to be a certain way, for people to see him a certain way. When they don't, he shook his head. He cuts them off, like they never existed. He's done it to people his whole life. "He did it to you too," she said. Gideon looked at her. She looked back, steady and unashamed of the observation. "Yeah," he said, "he did. But you came anyway, when he asked you to the platform." "I came because he's my brother," he said. "Not because he deserves it. Those are different reasons." She thought about that. "My sister stopped speaking to me 5 years ago," she said. "When our mother died and I got the house and she didn't, even though I was the one who'd stayed and nursed her. Sent me one letter saying I'd stolen it. I wrote back. She never answered." He was quiet. People who feel entitled to things, she said. When they don't get them, they don't ask themselves if they were wrong. They decide you were wrong instead. It's easier. Silas has never been wrong about anything, Gideon said, according to Silas. He'll be wrong about me, she said. Not with heat, just with the plain certainty of someone stating a fact they already know and are simply waiting for the world to catch up to. Gideon picked up his fork again. Outside, the snow was building on the windowsill, a thin white line growing at the bottom of the glass. The fire crackled. The cracked baffle plate let out a thin ribbon of smoke that curled toward the ceiling, and he'd gotten so used to it that he barely noticed it anymore. But he noticed it now because she would notice it, and she did. He saw her eyes go to it briefly, calculate it, file it away. "You should sleep," he said when the plates were empty. "Loft's made up. There's an extra blanket in the chest at the foot." She nodded and stood. She took her plate to the dry sink and rinsed it, because she was not the kind of person who left her dishes for someone else. At the foot of the ladder, she paused and looked back at him. "Gideon." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Not for what I think you're expecting me to thank you for. Not for rescuing me." She said the word without bitterness, but with precision, making clear she knew the difference between what had happened and what people might call it. "For the contract. For treating it like a business arrangement and not a favor." "It is a business arrangement," he said. "For now." "For now," she agreed. She looked at him one moment longer, then she climbed the ladder, and he heard the loft floor creak under her weight, and then the sound of the chest opening and the blanket being unfolded, and then quiet. He sat at the table for a while with the fire burning low and the snow outside coming down harder now, building towards something serious. And he thought about the day. About standing on that platform with his bad coffee. About Silas walking away without a word. About the look on her face, not broken, not defeated, just recalculating, the way a navigator recalculates when land doesn't appear where the map said it would. He'd acted on instinct, and instinct had gotten him into situations before that he'd regretted. But sitting here now in the quiet of the cabin with the smell of the meal still in the air and the evidence of her presence, the coat on the peg, the rinsed plate on the dry sink, the bag at the base of the ladder, he didn't feel the particular weight he usually felt when he'd done something rash. He felt something else, something closer to relief. He banked the stove the way he always banked it, careful and methodical, and then he lay down on his bedroll on the main room floor and listened to the snow on the roof and to the sound of another person breathing somewhere above him, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he slept better than he had in years. He was already up when she came down the ladder the next morning, the stove going and a pot of coffee on, and the first thing she noticed was that he'd left her cup on her side of the table without being asked which side was hers. He'd just decided, and he'd decided right. She didn't say anything about it. She poured her coffee and looked out the south window at what the night had left them. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, but it had done its work. The porch railing had disappeared under 8 inches of it, and the wood stacks were white-capped, and the trail down to the main road had become a suggestion rather than a fact. The sky had gone the hard, particular blue that meant cold and clarity and no more precipitation for a while, which was the only good news the morning had to offer. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Manageable," he said. "I've cleared the path to the paddock already. Fletcher's fed. The trail to the road is passable on horseback, but not easy. We should go to Dalrymple's this morning while we've got the light." She nodded and drank her coffee standing up. He noticed she did that, stood while she drank, like sitting down in the morning was a luxury she hadn't given herself permission to take yet. He didn't comment on it. They ate quickly. She found bread he hadn't finished and cut 2 slices without asking him if he wanted any, because of course he wanted some, and she heated them against the stovetop the same way she'd done with the cornbread the night before. He ate his standing up too, and it occurred to him that they were more similar in their habits than he might have expected 2 strangers to be. The ride down to Cartwell was cold and quiet, and took nearly an hour because Fletcher had to pick through the snow carefully on the steeper sections. Beatrice sat behind him the same way she had the night before, her weight balanced and steady, adjusting to the horse's movement without being told to. He was starting to understand that she adjusted to most things without being told to. It was either a virtue or the mark of someone who'd been required to adapt so often that it had become automatic, and he suspected it was probably both. Dalrymple's hardware was open. Tom Dalrymple was a broad, weathered man who'd run the shop for 30 years and knew every rancher and homesteader within 40 miles by name and by credit history. He looked up from behind his counter when Gideon walked in, and his eyes moved immediately to Beatrice behind him, and then back to Gideon with a question he was too polite to ask out loud. "Stoveplate," Gideon said. "Cast iron, 4-plate configuration, the north baffle. Cracked through." "I've got 2 in the back," Dalrymple said. He was still looking at Beatrice, not rudely, but in the careful way of a man who had heard the story already. Because in a town the size of Cartwell, by the next morning, after a thing happened on the train platform, everyone had heard the story and was trying to figure out what the story actually was. Beatrice stepped forward and put her hand on the counter. "Can I see them both?" Dalrymple blinked. "Ma'am?" "Both plates. I want to see the casting quality on both before we buy one." She said it without challenge, just with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who knew what they were there for and wanted to get it done. Dalrymple went to the back and came out with both plates, setting them on the counter. Beatrice picked up each one in turn, turned it over, ran her thumb along the casting seam, held it up to look at the edge. She set one down and kept hold of the other. "This one," she said. "The seam on the other one is rough. It'll develop a hairline crack within 2 seasons. Dalrymple looked at the plate she'd set down, then at her. "You know cast iron?" "My father had a foundry operation. Small, but we cast our own household hardware for years." She set the good plate back on the counter. "What do you want for it?" The price Dalrymple named was fair. They paid it and carried the plate out wrapped in burlap, and it wasn't until they were back on Fletcher and heading toward the road out of town that Beatrice said quietly, "That man knew about yesterday." "Yes," Gideon said. "The whole town knows." "Probably." She was quiet for a moment, and he felt the slight shift in the weight behind him that wasn't about the horse's movement. It was her, adjusting something inside herself, settling something down. "Is that going to be a problem for you?" she asked. "People knowing." "No," he said. "Is it going to be a problem for you?" She thought about that honestly, which he'd already noticed she did. She didn't give fast answers to questions that deserved slower ones. "It was embarrassing yesterday," she said. "I don't think it'll be embarrassing tomorrow. You can't be embarrassed by someone else's behavior forever. At some point it just becomes information about who they are." "That's a useful way to look at it," he said. "It took me most of the night to get there," she said, which was honest and which he appreciated. They were back at this cabin by midday, and the afternoon was all work, the kind of immediate, non-optional work that a mountain homestead in October demanded. Gideon pulled out the old cracked baffle plate from the stove, which was a 2-person job even when you knew what you were doing, because the thing weighed 40 pounds, and the space around it was tight, and every surface near a stove that's been burning all winter was seasoned with grease and soot. Beatrice held the new plate steady while he seated it, her arms braced against the weight without complaint, adjusting her grip when he asked her to without losing the tension. When it was seated and the seals were packed with fresh stove cement, they fired it up cautiously and stood back and watched the draw. The smoke went straight up the chimney, no curl toward the ceiling. The heat came out even and strong. "Better," she said. "Much better," he said, and he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. What happened over the following weeks happened the way most things happen in a working life. Not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small ones. The morning she took the axe without asking and split the entire east stack before he'd finished his first coffee. The afternoon she spent 3 hours on her hands and knees resealing the gap under the cabin's north wall where cold air had been seeping through all the previous winter, using a mixture of clay and dried grass she'd packed herself, a technique she explained she'd learned from her father's neighbor, an older Cherokee man who had shown her the method when she was 12. The evening she rebuilt the lower shelf in the root cellar because the board had been bowing under the weight of the canned goods and would have collapsed by December, doing it in the lamplight after supper with planks she'd cut herself from a piece of leftover timber she'd found in the lean-to. He watched all of this not because he was testing her, he'd stopped thinking in those terms within the first 3 days, but because he was genuinely interested. She solved problems differently than he did. Where he tended to go at a problem directly and with force, she thought around it first, mapped it from different angles, considered what she had available before deciding what she needed to go get. Her solutions were often more elegant than his, though she'd have resisted that word because she wasn't interested in elegant, only in what worked. They fell into a rhythm without deciding to. He was up first because he'd always been up first. And by the time she came down, the coffee was ready, and she didn't thank him for it past the first week because it was no longer a gesture. It was just what happened in the morning. She took on the root cellar inventory and the food preservation without being asked, because she could see the gaps in what he'd put up, and she had opinions about them. He took on the outer work, the fence lines, the trap lines, the wood hauling, but she joined him for the heavy parts when the day's indoor tasks were done, because she could see that some of it needed two people, and it made no sense to let him struggle alone when she had arms that worked. The first time she came with him to check the south fence line, she wore his spare work coat because hers wasn't heavy enough, and it was too wide across the shoulders and not quite long enough for her frame, and she looked completely unbothered by this, which he noted and thought about later. She'd worn her whole life like that coat, not quite the right fit by someone else's measure, and absolutely unfazed by it. The fence had been pushed in by elk in 3 places. They worked through it together, resetting the posts where they'd been knocked loose, restringing wire where it had been stretched or snapped. It was cold work and slow, and their breath came out in white clouds, and their fingers got stiff inside their gloves. She didn't complain. He wouldn't have expected her to, by this point, but he still noticed. "You said your father had a foundry operation," he said, around the second fence post, because they'd been mostly quiet, and he'd been thinking about it. "Small operation," she said, driving a staple with the butt of her fence tool. "Cast household hardware, some agricultural fittings. He had 3 workers and me." "And you learned the trade." "I learned enough to understand what we were making and what it needed to be right. I was never going to inherit it. Women didn't." She said this without bitterness, just as a fact. "When he died, it went to his business partner by prior agreement. The house went to me and my sister." She paused. "Then just me." "And you sold it." "Sold the house, kept nothing that wouldn't fit in a bag." She looked at him sideways. "I didn't want things. Things tie you to a place that might not deserve to hold you." He thought about that while he worked the wire through the staple. "What made you try the agency, the mail order arrangement?" She took a moment before answering, which again he'd come to expect. "I was 31, and I'd been living on what I made doing accounts for a dry goods merchant for 2 years. It was sufficient, just sufficient, and I looked at my life and I could see it. I could see every year from that one all the way to the end, and it looked the same all the way through." She drove another staple. "I didn't want a husband particularly. I wanted something different, a different kind of life. Work that was real work, something I could build and see the building of." She stopped and looked at the fence line stretching west through the trees. "This wasn't what I imagined, but it's real work. I can see it." He looked at the fence line too. "You ever going to tell me what you imagined?" She almost smiled. She was doing that more, almost smiling, and twice it had gotten all the way to an actual smile, though both times had been brief and private seeming, like she wasn't sure yet if she was allowed to smile fully around him. "Someone kinder looking than your brother," she said. "Roughly." He laughed. It came out short and unpracticed because he laughed infrequently, but it was genuine. "That's a low bar." "I had low expectations," she said. "I've revised them." She said it looking at the fence, not at him, and she moved to the next post before he could respond. He let it go, but he held on to it, the information of it, which was more information than she probably realized she'd given him. The weeks moved and deepened. October became November in the way mountain Novembers arrive. Not gradually, but with sudden conviction, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in 2 days and staying there, the trails hardening to iron, the creek freezing over at the edges, and then all the way across. The work shifted from building and repairing to the more relentless work of maintenance, of keeping things from breaking down in the cold, of staying ahead of the weather rather than responding to it. Beatrice was stronger than he'd known a woman could be. He didn't think this with any condescension. It was a genuine recalibration of his understanding, the kind you can only get from working alongside someone. She could carry a 120-pound grain sack from the storage shed to the cabin without stopping, carrying it across her body rather than on her back, which was a smarter way to do it and not the way he'd always done it. When they slaughtered the 2 shoats he'd been fattening since August, she worked the carcasses with a butchering skill that was cleaner and faster than his own. The cuts precise and deliberate, nothing wasted, every part going somewhere useful. She rendered the lard without being told it needed doing. She started the sausage casings before he'd even thought about them. He found himself watching her work and revising his understanding of things in ways he hadn't expected. They started having real conversations. Not the transactional ones. Not who's going to check the traps tomorrow, or we need more salt, or the northeast corner of the roof. Sounds like it's moving, but real ones, the kind that required something from both people. "What do you miss?" she asked him one evening. They were at the table after supper, and the fire was strong, and the wind was doing something unpleasant outside, but not threatening yet, just noisy. She was mending a tear in her work shirt, and he was working grease into a trap spring that had been stiffening. He didn't pretend he didn't understand the question. "My mother's cooking," he said immediately. Not because she was a great cook, she wasn't, but she made this one thing, venison stew with dried apples in it, and I haven't had it since she died, and I've tried to make it 3 times and it's never right. How long ago did she die? 14 years? He worked the grease into the spring. You? My father's voice, she said. He used to read out loud to us after supper, old stories. He had a particular voice for reading, different from his regular voice. Slower, like he believed every word. She pulled the needle through. I'd like to hear that voice again. Just once. What did he read? Everything. Newspapers, history. He loved history. He could spend an hour reading about the Revolutionary War and make you feel like you were cold and hungry in a valley somewhere. She snipped the thread. He'd have liked you, I think. Gideon looked up. She was looking at her mending, not at him. Why? He asked. He respected people who worked without complaint and kept their word. She folded the shirt. He didn't have much use for charm, said it was usually just bad intentions dressed up nice. Your brother-in-law, he said carefully. Did your father know him before he died? He met him twice. She set the shirt on the table. He didn't say anything, but he was quiet in a way he wasn't quiet around people he liked. My father was the opposite, Gideon said. He liked Silas best, always had. Silas looked the way he thought a son should look, and he behaved the way my father thought a son should behave, confidently, loudly, like every room belonged to him. He set down the trap spring. My father thought confidence was the same thing as capability. He never really worked out that they weren't. And you got the land that was left over, she said. I got the mountain land, the high ground, the land he couldn't sell, couldn't farm easily, couldn't show to people and have them nod approvingly. He looked at the table. He didn't think he was punishing me. He thought he was being realistic. He thought I was suited for hard land because I was a hard kind of man. He paused. I wasn't wrong, exactly, but he wasn't right either. He didn't see that hard land well worked is worth more than easy land wasted, she said. He looked at her. That's what this is, she said, gesturing around her. Hard land, well worked. You've done something with it. We've done something with it, he said. And he meant it, because in 6 weeks she had already changed the shape of what he'd built, not by undoing any of it, but by adding to it with such steadiness that it was hard now to see where his work ended and hers began. She held his gaze for just a moment, the longest she'd held it in a while, and then she looked away, which was fine. They were still learning what they could hold between them. Some things needed to be approached slowly or they'd startle away. The trouble came in the 3rd week of November, and it came from the direction neither of them had been watching. Gideon had been out on the north trap line all morning, working through 6 miles of trail in bitter cold, and he came back to the cabin to find Beatrice at the table with a piece of paper in her hand and her face doing something careful and controlled that he'd learned meant she was angry and choosing how to be angry deliberately. He shook the snow off his coat at the door. What's that? She set the paper on the table so he could see it. It was a letter delivered by one of the Halbert ranch hands who apparently rode up the mountain every few weeks with mail and supplies for the Ashcroft place. Though no one had told Beatrice this was the arrangement, and the ranch hand had left it and gone before she'd understood who he was. The letter was from Silas. It was addressed to Gideon only. Beatrice had opened it because she'd been the only one there and hadn't known not to, and also because she'd seen her own name in the first line through the envelope paper and thought it might be intended for her. Her name appeared in the first line as follows. I see you've decided to keep playing house with the reject bride, which I suppose is your business. But I want to make clear before you get any more attached that the woman is not what she presented herself to be. Gideon read the letter. It took 2 minutes. His jaw moved once, about halfway through, and then it stopped moving and he read the rest with his face very still. When he finished, he set it down flat on the table. He says I lied to the agency, Beatrice said. About my age. And about my... He says I described myself as stout in my correspondence, and that the photograph the agency sent was not recent. She said it levelly, though he could hear the effort in that levelness. He says he's written to the agency to report me. He says he can have the marriage voided on grounds of misrepresentation. Can he? She asked, and it was the first time since the train platform that her voice had held something that might have been fear underneath it. Not terror, not panic, but something careful, something that remembered what it felt like to have the ground shift. Gideon picked up the letter and walked to the stove and put it in. Beatrice watched it catch. That doesn't answer my question. He can't, Gideon said. The marriage was contracted between you and me, not between you and the agency. He has no standing. Judge Halbert drew up the contract himself, and he'll say the same. He stood watching the letter burn. The agency might drop you from their roster. That won't affect anything here. She breathed out. You're sure? I'm sure. He turned from the stove. And I should tell you, the photograph question. I need to know if that's true, not because it changes anything, but because I want to know what we're dealing with. She met his eyes. I told the agency I was 29. I'm 31. She held his gaze. And the photograph was from 3 years ago. I was smaller then, not dramatically, but I was. She paused. I didn't lie with the intent to deceive so much as I made myself more palatable because I knew what men wanted. She said it without apology, but with a kind of tired honesty that was harder to look at than the letter had been. I've known what men want since I was 17 years old. I never met those requirements. I tried, once, with the photograph. I won't again. He was quiet for a moment, then, You were smaller in the photograph. Yes. Now you've spent 6 weeks hauling wood and resetting fence posts and butchering elk. Yes. Then the photograph was probably taken in a better growing season, he said, and the current version is clearly better suited to the work. He went to the shelf and got the coffee. Do you want some? She stared at him. That's all you have to say about it? I knew who you were before I read the letter, he said. I knew who you were before we got married. The letter didn't change anything. She was quiet. She looked at the stove, at the letter now fully ash inside it. He wrote it to hurt me, she said. Yes. He wanted you to doubt me. Yes. Does it work? The doubt? Gideon poured 2 cups and set one on her side of the table. He sat down across from her. You rebuilt my root cellar shelf, he said. You replaced a baffle plate that I'd been managing with ash paste for 2 months. You sealed the north wall gap that's been losing me heat for 3 winters. You've been out on the fence line twice in weather I'd have gone alone before. He looked at her. The only doubt I have is about my brother's ability to recognize what's in front of him. I don't have any doubt about you. She looked at her coffee. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way she did when she was thinking. Outside, the wind was building again, something more serious than the night before, and they could both hear it, the particular pitch of wind that was about to be weather. He won't stop, she said. This is 1 letter. He'll send more. Probably, Gideon agreed. What do we do about it? He considered. We do what we've been doing, he said. We work. We build what we're building, and we let him exhaust himself against something that doesn't move. He drank his coffee. He'll come up here eventually. He always has to see things for himself, has to verify that the world has done what he thinks he told it to do. When he comes, he'll see what you've built, and he won't be able to say anything about it that'll hold up. She looked at him. You've known him a long time. My whole life, he said. He's been the same my whole life. He needs to win. He needs to be seen winning. When he can't, he shook his head. He gets louder. He pushes harder. And eventually he realizes there's nothing there to push against and he has to go back to where he came from. And if he doesn't? Gideon looked at her steadily. Then we deal with that when it comes. Together. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once and picked up her coffee and stood up, because the wind had made its decision and they could hear it now in the eaves, and there was work to do before it got dark. She put on her coat. She picked up the heavy gloves she'd hung by the door. She looked back at him. The south woodpile needs a cover before this wind. If it gets into the splits, they'll take up moisture. He was already reaching for his own coat. I've got a canvas in the lean-to. I'll get it, she said, and she pushed out the door into the cold before he could argue, which was exactly what he would have done, and they both knew it. He followed her out. The wind hit them both at once, mean and purposeful, the kind of wind that was practicing for something worse. They worked fast, pulling the canvas over the south pile and lashing it down with the rope that ran under the porch rail. Both of them braced against the gusts, neither of them talking because talking in wind that loud was mostly pointless. She held her side of the canvas without being told which side to take. He tied his corner, and she'd already tied hers. They came back in and stood just inside the door, breathing hard, and she pulled off one glove to check a finger she'd knocked on the rail in the wind. "Okay?" he asked. She looked at the finger. Knocked, not broken. She pulled the glove back on. They stood there for a moment in the small warmth of the just-closed door, and the wind pushed hard against the cabin wall, and the fire in the stove responded with a small brightening, and Gideon thought, this is what it is. This is what it looks like when something is working. Not perfectly, not without trouble, but working the way a good joint works, each piece doing what the other can't, the pressure making both of them stronger rather than wearing either of them down. He didn't say any of that out loud. There would have been no point. They both already knew it. What he said was, "I'll check the roof boards before dark. The northwest corner has been moving." What she said was, "I'll start supper. We still have the last of that smoked shoulder." And they went to their separate tasks, and the wind built outside and the cabin held. The second letter arrived 11 days after the first. The Halbert ranch hand, a young man named Cord who couldn't have been more than 17, and who had the good sense to look uncomfortable delivering what he was delivering, came up the trail on a gray Tuesday morning while Gideon was on the North Ridge checking a section of trapline, and Beatrice was alone at the cabin splitting the last of the unseasoned birch they'd dragged down from the upper woodlot 2 days before. She was mid-swing when she heard the horse. She set the axe and walked to the edge of the porch and watched Cord pick his way up the last section of trail. He held out the envelope before he'd fully stopped the horse, which told her everything about the letter before she opened it. "From Mr. Silas Ashcroft," Cord said. He had the look of a boy who had been told to deliver something and had not been told he could refuse. He said it was important. "I imagine he did," Beatrice said. She took the envelope. "Thank you, Cord. There's coffee on the stove if you want to come in and warm up before you ride back." He looked surprised by the offer. He accepted it because he was cold and 17 and it was a long ride back. She poured him a cup and he sat at the edge of the table and didn't say anything, which was considerate of him. She opened the letter standing at the south window with the light coming in. This one was longer. Silas had been busy. He'd written to the Wyoming Territorial Land Office, or claimed to have, raising a question about the validity of the land contract Gideon had filed the day of the marriage. His argument, laid out in the cramped, precise handwriting of a man who believed his own case completely, was that the contract had been filed under circumstances of duress and haste, that the woman named as co-holder had no prior established residency or connection to the territory, and that the division of the Ashcroft family land as administered by their late father's estate had included a covenant restricting the transfer of the mountain parcel to any non-family party without the consent of the surviving Ashcroft heir, meaning Silas himself. Beatrice read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and finished her coffee standing up. "Cord," she said. The boy looked up. "When you get back to the Halbert place, is there any chance you'd be riding past town?" "I go through Cartwell on the way back," he said. "Would you be willing to stop at Judge Halbert's office? I assume he's some relation to your employer?" "Uncle," Cord said. "Would you stop and leave a message that Gideon Ashcroft and his wife would like to meet with him at his earliest convenience? This week, if possible." Cord nodded carefully. "He's going to ask what it's about." "Tell him it's about a land covenant clause that may or may not exist," she said, "and that I'd like to see the original estate filing before we discuss anything else." Cord looked at her with the particular expression young men got when they encountered a woman doing something they hadn't expected a woman to do. Not hostile, just recalibrating. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He finished his coffee and put his hat on and went back out to his horse. Beatrice went back to splitting wood. She was still at it when Gideon came down from the North Ridge an hour later. He came into the yard and read her posture before he was halfway across it. The set of her shoulders, the particular rhythm of her swing, which was harder and more deliberate than the task required, and he stopped at the porch rail. "What happened?" She stopped mid-swing. She put the axe down with the head in the snow and pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out. He read it. She watched him read it the same way she'd watched him the first time. That single jaw movement about halfway through, then the stillness. When he looked up, his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen in them before. Not anger exactly, something older and more tired than anger. "The covenant clause," he said. "I don't know if it exists." "Neither do I," she said. "That's the problem. My father's estate was filed through Judge Halbert's predecessor, a man named Quirt, who retired 4 years ago and moved to Denver." He looked at the letter again. "If there's a covenant clause, it would be in the original estate filing. I've never read the full document. My father showed me the land division summary, not the underlying papers." "Silas has read them," she said. "He wouldn't raise this if he hadn't." Gideon was quiet. He looked at the letter, at the mountains, at the axe standing in the snow. "He might be bluffing," he said, "trying to make us react." "He might be," she agreed. "But if we don't check and there is a clause, we've handed him everything." She took the letter back. "I sent word to Judge Halbert through Cord. I asked to see the original estate filing." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, surprise, and then something past surprise that took her a moment to identify. It was relief. The relief of a person who'd spent a long time handling things alone and had just found out again that they didn't have to. "Good," he said. "That's exactly right." He picked up the axe she'd set down and split the round she'd been working on, one stroke, clean through, because he needed to do something physical with his hands. "When does Halbert get back to us?" "Cord said he goes through town on Tuesdays, so by Thursday at the latest." 3 days. 3 days, she agreed. They didn't talk about it again that night, because there was nothing useful to say until they had the document in front of them. And talking about a problem you can't yet act on is just a way of making it larger. But it was there between them at supper, and it was there when they banked the fire, and it was there when she climbed the ladder and lay in the loft listening to the wind, which had something in it now, some low, persistent note that hadn't been there in November, deeper, more deliberate, the sound the mountain made when it was preparing something serious. She lay there and stared at the dark ceiling and ran through the letter again from memory. The specific language mattered. Covenant restricting the transfer of the mountain parcel to any non-family party. The question was whether a wife, under territorial law, constituted a family party or a non-family transfer. It was the kind of question that turned on specific wording, and specific wording was what she needed to see. She had done accounts for 2 years. Before that, she'd helped her father with the foundry paperwork, contracts, purchase orders, correspondence with suppliers. She was not a lawyer, but she knew documents. She knew how language worked in documents, how a single word in the wrong place could mean something entirely different from what the writer intended, or exactly what they intended, and nothing else. The document would tell her something. She just needed to see it. She slept eventually, and she dreamed about Ohio, her father's voice reading something she couldn't quite hear, the words just out of reach. By Thursday morning, the snow had picked up again, serious and sustained this time. Not the passing flurries of early November, but the settled, purposeful snowfall of a winter that had made up its mind. Gideon was watching the sky in the way he'd developed over 20 years of reading mountain weather, not casually but with his full attention, the way you read a face when you need to know what it's actually saying. "How bad?" Beatrice asked. She was on the porch checking the woodstack covers, which they'd reinforced after Silas's letter arrived. Not because the letter had anything to do with wood covers, but because anxiety expressed itself in useful action when you were the kind of people they were. "Bad," he said. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's coming." Coming like last week or coming like something worse? He looked at the upper ridge, at the cloud formation sitting hard against it, low and gray and without the texture that meant passing weather. "Worse," he said. "I want to check the roof before anything else today." The roof was a standing concern. The cabin had been built solid in its walls and floor, but the roof had been added to over the years by different hands with different standards. And there were sections of it, particularly the northwest quarter that Gideon had noted 2 weeks back, that were carrying too much weight on beams that had been undersized the second time they'd been replaced. Gideon had known this and had been managing it with regular clearing, but regular clearing required getting up there every heavy snow, which required time and clear enough weather to work in, and ideally 2 people. They went up together that morning, Gideon with the long-handled roof rake and Beatrice with the grain shovel, which she'd argued was more efficient for the packed accumulation around the chimney base, and she'd been right. The footing was difficult, the roof pitch was moderate, but the surface was ice under the fresh snow, and they both moved carefully, testing each step before committing to it. Gideon ran a rope from the chimney bracket down the slope to give them something to hold, and they worked from the center outward, clearing the heavy wet snow in sections. The northwest corner was worse than he'd assessed from below. When Beatrice got to it and put her weight on the boards to test them, she could feel the flex, a slight but definite give that shouldn't have been there in a sound structure. "Gideon," she said. He came across carefully. She watched him press down on the boards with his boot heel, feeling what she'd felt. His face went through something. "That beam," she said. "The main rafter. Is it the original?" "It was replaced 8 years ago, but I used what I had, which was birch. I didn't have enough fire, and birch was what I could cut that season. Birch compresses under sustained load," she said, "and 8 years of freeze-thaw cycles—" "I know," he said. "I know. It should have been replaced last summer, and I ran out of season." He looked at the corner. "If we get a heavy load up here, it'll go," she said. "The question is when." He looked at the sky. "That's the wrong question. The question is whether we can reinforce it before the snow I'm seeing in those clouds gets here." They came down off the roof, and Gideon went to the lean-to and came back with the only fir beam he had on the property. A 16-footer he'd been saving for a planned extension on the lean-to itself, cut and cured but not yet used. It was too long, but he could cut it. More immediately, they needed to get it up to the roof and into position before the weather changed, and it weighed close to 200 pounds. "Tell me what you need me to do," Beatrice said. He looked at the beam, at the roof, at her. He was doing the geometry of it in his head. "I need you to take the heavy end on your shoulder and walk it up while I guide the front. The roof hatch is in the north section, 3 feet back from the ridge. If we can get it through the hatch, we can seat it from inside the attic space." "There's an attic?" "More of a crawl space. 2 feet of clearance. I haven't been up there in a year." "Show me the hatch." They spent the next 2 hours doing the kind of work that separates people who can think through a physical problem under pressure from people who can't. Getting the beam up the external ladder required both of them on it at once, which meant coordinating weight and angle on a surface that was slippery and a ladder that was not designed for two. Beatrice took the bottom end across her right shoulder and braced it with both arms, and Gideon took the top, and they moved it up one rung at a time with the kind of steady, non-panicking communication that sounded from the outside like almost nothing. Short words, pauses, adjustments. And underneath was the result of 6 weeks of working together until each of them knew how the other moved. When the beam was through the hatch and laid out along the crawl space floor, they both sat on the roof for a moment, catching their breath. The snow was coming heavier now, and the wind had a new edge in it. Below them, the yard was already going white again. "We're not going to get this seated today," Gideon said. He was looking at the sky. He'd been looking at it all morning. "We might have an hour of workable light left." "Then what's the priority?" "Getting the beam in position so it's ready, and getting down off this roof before the wind picks up." He looked at the northwest corner. "If the snow load gets bad tonight—" "I'll hear it," she said. "I'm in the loft. If the boards start talking, I'll wake you." He looked at her. "You'll hear it before I will down below." "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." They got the beam into rough position inside the crawl space. Not seated, not braced, but aligned so that tomorrow morning, with tools and time, they could complete the reinforcement properly. Then they came down and got inside, and Beatrice made coffee, and they stood at the south window and watched the sky make its decision. It made it fast. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was going and the snow was coming horizontal, driven by a wind that had stopped being gradual and become constant and serious. They battened everything that needed battening: the lean-to door, the paddock gate, the shutter on the north window that had been sitting unsecured since October. Fletcher was in the paddock with extra hay, and the paddock walls were solid enough to break the worst of the wind, but Gideon went out twice to check on him anyway, because horses in blizzards required checking on regardless of the math. The second time he came back in, Beatrice had supper on, and Judge Halbert's messenger had been and gone, which Gideon didn't know until she handed him a folded note that had been tucked under the porch door. He read it. The judge had found the estate filing. There was in fact a covenant clause. His father had been more careful with the paperwork than Gideon had known. But the judge had read it carefully, and the clause as written restricted transfer of the mountain parcel to persons not of familial relation by blood or marriage. By marriage. Beatrice's name, as Gideon's legal wife and co-holder of the property contract filed the same day, satisfied the clause. Silas had either misread it or had read it accurately and hoped they wouldn't check. Gideon handed the note to Beatrice. She read it. She set it on the table. He misread it, she said. Or he didn't. Does it matter? It matters to understanding what he'll do next, she said. If he misread it, he'll back down when he realizes. If he knew and tried it anyway, she stopped. He'll try something else either way, Gideon said. That's who he is. She looked at the note. We should write to the land office directly, file our own correspondence confirming the marriage and our joint holding. Beat him to whatever he's planning. Can you draft that letter? Yes, she said. Tonight, if you want. Tonight, he agreed. They ate and she drafted the letter at the table after supper, writing it out in the clear, precise hand he'd noticed the day they were married. He read it over her shoulder when she finished. She didn't ask him to, but she didn't move away when he leaned in, which was its own kind of permission. The letter was exact and unambiguous, and cited the relevant clause language directly. It was better than anything he would have written himself. You're good at this, he said. Accounts and contracts are the same thing, she said. You find the number or the word that has to be right, and you make it right, and everything else follows. He sat back down. The fire was burning well and the wind was doing something tremendous outside. Not dangerous yet, not structurally serious, but the kind of wind that reminded you what the mountain was and who it belonged to, which was itself and no one else. The cabin held. She sealed the letter and set it on the shelf to go out with Cord on his next pass, whenever the weather cleared enough for horses on the trail. Then the night deepened and they went to their separate places, her up the ladder to the loft, him on his bedroll below. And the blizzard that Gideon had been watching for 2 days finally arrived in full. It arrived like something that had been thinking about it. The wind came first, the real wind, not the forerunner, but the thing itself. A sustained roar that built over 20 minutes from serious to enormous, driving snow against the south and west faces of the cabin in waves that Gideon could feel through the floor. He lay on his bedroll and listened to the cabin and could hear it working, the way a good structure worked, taking the load and distributing it. The joints doing what joints were supposed to do, creaking slightly, but holding. He'd built well enough. The question was whether well enough was enough for this. He was still awake at midnight when he heard Beatrice's voice from the loft. Gideon. I hear it, he said, because he'd been hearing it for the last 10 minutes. A new sound in the northwest corner, distinct from the wind noise, lower and more internal. A sound that came from inside the structure. He was up and had his boots and coat on before she came down the ladder. She came down in her work clothes. She'd slept in them, which he'd also done because neither of them was the kind of person who undressed completely in weather they were watching. The beam, she said, the snow load on the northwest corner. He was already moving to the crawlspace hatch in the north room. I need to get up there and see how the alignment shifted in the wind. I'm going with you, she said. It's a 2-foot crawlspace. I know what it is. I need to go with you because if the beam needs to be seated, you can't do it alone from that angle. You need someone on the other end. She was already pulling on her second boot. Don't argue with me about something we already know the answer to. He didn't argue. The crawlspace was cold and dark and smelled of old pine and the particular mineral smell of a roof under heavy snow. A smell like pressure, like compressed air, which was essentially what it was. They worked by lantern light, both of them on their hands and knees. And when they got to the northwest section, Gideon held the lantern up, and they both looked at what the night had done. The beam had moved. Not much, 4, maybe 5 inches, but in the wrong direction, shifting with the weight of snow above it rather than against it. The old birch rafter below was flexing visibly, not cracked, not failed, but working at its limit, and the snow wasn't done yet. We seed it now, Beatrice said. She wasn't asking. In the dark, on our knees, with that wind on the roof. If it goes the rest of the way and takes the corner section with it, she said. And then we have a much worse problem in a much worse place to have it. He looked at the beam. He looked at her. Her face in the lantern light was completely steady. Not fearless, because she wasn't stupid, but decided. There was a difference, and he knew it, and he trusted the decided look more than he would have trusted fearless. All right, he said. Here's what we do. They worked in that crawl space for 2 hours. 2 hours on hands and knees and occasionally flat on their stomachs, using a short timberjack. Gideon had had the presence of mind to bring up with them, and a wedge and block system that Beatrice worked out as they went, adjusting for the limited clearance and the angle of the weight. She held things. She braced things. She held the lantern in one hand and a holding block in the other and told him when the angle was right and when it wasn't, because from her position she could see the rafter's deflection better than he could. Her hands were steady. The cold in the crawl space was serious. Their breath came out in clouds, and the lantern's warmth reached maybe 2 feet in any direction. And she didn't complain about it or rush because of it, because she'd learned in 6 weeks here that rushing in the cold was how you made mistakes. When the fir beam was seated and blocked and they'd driven the wedges home, the sound from the rafter changed, not dramatically, but the flex sound stopped. The roof above them was still working hard under the snow load, but it was doing it from a better position, the load now distributed through the new beam down to the wall plate where it belonged. Gideon sat back against the crawl space wall and looked at what they'd done. Beatrice sat across from him, the lantern between them, both of them breathing hard. "It'll hold now?" she asked. "It'll hold," he said. "We'll reinforce the blocking tomorrow when the light's better. But it'll hold through tonight." She nodded. She looked at the beam, at the wedges, at the old birch rafter that had been carrying too much for too long, and was now, finally, getting help. Something in her face, not the work face, not the problem-solving face, but something underneath both of those, moved. "You'd have lost the corner," she said. Not accusingly, just saying it. "Yes," he said, "I'd have lost the corner. Alone. You'd have woken up and heard it when it was too late to do anything but manage the damage." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him in the lantern light. "That's why you needed someone." "That's one reason," he said. She held his gaze. The wind outside was enormous, the blizzard doing something tremendous to the world above them, and they were 2 feet below the roof in the cold and dark, and neither of them looked away for a long moment. Then she said, "We should go back down before we lose feeling in our hands." "Yes," he said. They came back down through the hatch and into the main room where the stove was still burning strong, and Beatrice put her hands near the iron and let the feeling come back into her fingers, which was a particular kind of pain that didn't stop you from making a sound. She made a sound, short, controlled, through her teeth, and he didn't comment on it because she wouldn't want him to and because he was making a similar calculation with his own hands. "Coffee?" he said. "Please," she said. He put the pot back on and they sat at the table and waited for it, and the blizzard came down on the cabin with everything it had, and the roof held, and the stove burned, and outside in the paddock, Fletcher stood with his back to the wind and waited for morning the way horses did, without opinion about it. They drank their coffee and didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. They'd done what needed doing, and the roof was holding, and Silas's letter was answered, and the snow was still falling, and it would be falling when they woke up, and there would be more to do then. She finished her cup and set it down and looked at the table for a moment, and then she said, "My father would have liked this place, actually. The mountain." "Yeah?" He looked at her. "He'd have complained about everything," she said. "The trail, the cold, the distance from town. He'd have complained the whole first week." She picked up the cup again, though it was empty. "And then on the 7th or 8th day, he'd have gone out in the morning and looked at the mountain and come back in and not said anything at all. That was how you knew something had gotten to him, when he went quiet." Gideon thought about that. What would he have said eventually? She thought about it. Probably just... She paused. Probably something like, "Well, I see why you stayed." She set the empty cup down. The fire cracked once, settling. "I do," she said. "See why you stayed." Gideon looked at her across the table. The lantern light was low, and the storm was somewhere above them doing its best. And she was looking at the stove and not at him, and the distance between what he could say and what he wanted to say was not large, but it was still there, and he left it for now because some distances were worth crossing carefully. "Go get some sleep," he said. "I'll take the first watch." "You don't need to watch it all night," she said. "The beam will hold." "I know it will," he said. "I just want to listen to it for a while." She looked at him, a look that said she understood exactly what he meant, that listening to something you'd built together as it took the worst the mountain had to offer was not the same as worrying about it, and that she might have stayed up herself if he hadn't said it first. "Wake me at 3, she said. "I'll take the second watch." I won't need... Wake me at 3, she said again, and went up the ladder. He sat by the stove and listened to the cabin and the storm, and the roof held, and the beam held, and at 3 o'clock he climbed 2 rungs of the ladder and said her name quietly, and she said I'm up before he'd finished saying it, which meant she'd been listening too, which meant they were more alike than either of them had known when this started, and which meant a great many things that the morning would have to be the time for. The blizzard broke on the 4th day. It didn't apologize for what it had done. It simply stopped, the way mountain storms stopped, completely, without transition, as if the wind had made a decision and walked away from it. The morning after was the hard blue silence that Beatrice had come to recognize as the mountain's version of calm, which was not calm exactly, but the absence of active hostility, the world holding its breath between efforts. They spent the first day after the storm digging out, not talking much, not needing to. The rhythm of it was established by now, who took which section, who called out when something needed 2 people, how they moved around each other in a workspace without collision or apology. The paddock first because Fletcher needed access to the water trough, which had frozen solid and required Gideon's heaviest iron bar to break through. Then the path from cabin to lean-to. Then the lean-to itself, whose roof had taken a load that bowed the south wall slightly, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to note and add to the list. Then the wood stacks, uncovering the covered ones and assessing the uncovered sections, of which 2 had taken in moisture along the bottom row and would need to be restacked with the wet pieces on top to dry. Beatrice found that out by picking up the top row and finding the bottom row darker than it should have been. She didn't say anything about it for a moment, just stood there looking at it, and then she said, I should have covered this section too. I've left it uncovered every winter for 6 years, Gideon said, and lost the bottom row every time? He looked at it. The bottom row always goes a little soft in a bad storm, yes. Then we cover it next time, she said, and moved on to the next stack because mistakes weren't worth more than the lesson they contained, and she'd learned that early enough in her life that it was automatic now. He noted this. He noted a lot of things about her still, and he suspected he always would, that she was the kind of person you kept noticing because she kept doing things slightly differently than you expected, and the differences were almost always worth paying attention to. The crawlspace beam held. They went up to check it the second morning, both of them moving through the hatch with more ease than the first time because they knew the space now, knew where to put their knees and how to angle their shoulders. And when they got to the northwest corner, the beam was exactly where they'd wedged it. No movement, no new sounds. The old birch rafter was still in place, still flexing slightly when Gideon pressed on it, but carrying a shared load now rather than the whole of it. And a shared load was something even compromised wood could manage. He reinforced the blocking while she held the lantern, same as before, adding 2 additional wedges he'd cut that morning from the leftover fir scrap. When he drove the last one home and the sound came back right, solid, not giving, she said there, with a quiet finality that was more satisfying than any louder response would have been. Cord came up the trail 3 days after the storm with a response from Judge Halbert. The judge had received their letter, had filed a confirmation of the marriage and joint holding with the land office on their behalf, and had sent a separate note to the land office copying the relevant covenant clause language and its correct interpretation. He also included a personal note for Gideon, 3 lines, that said, Your brother came to see me 2 days ago. I told him the same thing I'm telling you. The filing stands. He left without a scene, which surprised me. Either he's accepted it or he's thinking. I'd watch for the second. Gideon read this at the table and passed it to Beatrice, who read it and set it down and said nothing for a moment. Either he's accepted it or he's thinking, she repeated. Halbert knows him, Gideon said. He's watched Silas operate for 15 years. That's not nothing. He's thinking, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Gideon said. They watched for it. December settled over the mountain like a verdict, the days short and the cold absolute and the work shifting fully into maintenance mode, keeping the stove fed, keeping the animals alive, keeping the paths passable, checking the structures after every wind. It was relentless and repetitive, and Beatrice didn't find it diminishing. She found it clarifying. You knew exactly what mattered up here because the consequence of not attending to what mattered was immediate and specific. There was a directness to it that she hadn't known she'd been wanting until she had it. She wrote a letter to a woman in Columbus she'd worked with briefly, a woman named Harriet, who'd been kind to her in the specific way of people who see something in you that you haven't yet seen yourself, and told her something of what her life had become. She didn't describe it romantically. She described the root cellar and the baffle plate and the blizzard and the crawl space beam, and she said, "I am more useful here than I have ever been anywhere. I don't know yet what else this is, but it is at minimum that." She didn't tell Gideon she'd written the letter. It felt like information that was still only hers, a private accounting of something not yet fully named. What happened between them that December happened the way most things happened between them. Not in a moment, not in a declaration, but in the steady accumulation of ordinary proximity. The evening she sat beside him at the table, not across from him, because the lamp was on his side and she was sewing by its light, and it simply made more sense to move. The morning she came down from the loft and he handed her coffee before she reached the table, because he'd heard her footstep on the third rung and known she was coming. The afternoon on the south fence line, when she slipped on an ice patch and caught his arm, and he caught hers, and they both went very still for a moment before the footing resolved itself, and neither of them said anything about it, but neither of them was quite the same after it either. He thought about what she'd said in the crawl space. "I do see why you stayed." And he thought about it more than was strictly useful. She'd meant the mountain. He was fairly sure she'd meant the mountain, but she'd looked at him when she said it, and that was the part that wouldn't leave him alone. He didn't push on it. Pushing was not how he operated, and more to the point, it was not what she needed. She'd been pushed off a train platform by one man's refusal to see her, and whatever grew between them would need to be her choice in a way that was undeniable, visible, clear to her own eyes. He could wait for that. He'd waited for most things in his life. He was constitutionally suited to it. Silas came in the second week of December. He didn't send word first. Gideon was in the lean-to sharpening the big draw knife when he heard Fletcher make the sound he made when another horse came up the trail. Not alarmed, just aware, a particular shift in his breathing. Gideon came to the lean-to door and looked up the trail and saw Silas's gray mare picking her way through the snow, and Silas on her back sitting the way he always sat a horse, like the horse owed him the ride. Gideon set down the draw knife. He didn't go inside to get Beatrice. He didn't call out to warn her. He stood at the lean-to door and waited, because whatever Silas had come here for, Gideon wanted to see it first. Silas pulled up in the yard and looked around slowly, the way he looked around places he was assessing for value. His eyes went to the wood stacks, the full, well-stacked, covered wood stacks. To the paddock, where Fletcher was in better condition than he'd been in 3 winters. To the lean-to extension Beatrice had suggested and that they'd framed in November. To the cabin itself, with the repaired porch hinge and the sealed north wall and the new smoke pattern from the straight-drawing chimney. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Gideon. "Brother," he said. "Silas," Gideon said, "you look well." He said it with the particular tone he had for compliments. He didn't mean his compliments, the tone that put a question mark on the observation. "Come to check?" Gideon said. "Came to talk." Silas dismounted and looped his mare's rein over the porch rail. I was dressed well, as always, good wool coat, hat in better repair than Gideon's, and he carried himself with the ease of a man who believed every room belonged to him, which extended, apparently, to open yards on other people's property. "About the land office letter," Gideon said. "Among other things." Silas looked at the cabin door. "Is she here?" "My wife is inside, yes." Silas looked at him with a complicated expression that Gideon had been seeing on his brother's face his whole life. The expression of a man who had expected the world to agree with him and was finding, again, that it hadn't. "I'd like to speak with you alone." "Whatever you have to say to me, you can say in front of her," Gideon said. "She's my business partner. Anything that concerns this property concerns her." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cabin again. "All right," he said. The cabin door opened before either of them moved toward it. Beatrice stood in the doorway. She'd heard the horses, of course she had, and she'd had enough time to decide how she was going to stand in that doorway. She stood straight and level, her work clothes clean, her hair pinned back, her hands at her sides. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't put her hands on the door frame. She just stood there, taking up exactly as much space as she was. And she looked at Silas with an expression that was not hostile and was not warm and was very, very clear. Silas looked at her. Something in his face worked through several things in quick succession: surprise, which he covered fast, and then reassessment, which took a little longer, and then something else that Gideon couldn't fully read because it was complicated by too many other things. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Silas said. He said it with something that was almost courtesy, probably because the evidence of the yard and the cabin and the straight-drawing chimney had adjusted his footing more than he wanted to admit. "Mr. Ashcroft," Beatrice said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll put coffee on." Silas glanced at Gideon, who said nothing, and then he came up the porch steps and through the door. Gideon followed. Inside, Silas stopped and looked around the way he'd looked around the yard. The root cellar door, sitting properly on its rehung hinge. The restocked shelves, full and organized, with nothing wasted and nothing missing. The table with the lamp on Beatrice's side. The stove drawing cleanly. The lower shelf in the root cellar that Beatrice had rebuilt, visible through the open root cellar door, solid and properly loaded. He looked at all of it, and Gideon watched him look. And it was interesting. The way Silas processed evidence that contradicted his expectations. He didn't do it easily. He did it slowly, and with something that might have been resistance, the way a man reads a contract that says something he hadn't planned for. Beatrice put the coffee on. She moved around the kitchen space with complete familiarity, not performing it, just doing it, and that familiarity was its own kind of statement. This was not a woman camping in a space. This was a woman in her kitchen. They sat down, all three of them, Gideon and Beatrice on one side of the table, without deciding to, which was how it happened. Silas across. Silas opened with the land office. He laid out his interpretation of the covenant clause, calmly, methodically, making his case as he would make it to a judge, which was telling, Beatrice thought, because it suggested he'd been practicing. When he finished, she opened the folder she'd placed on the table before he arrived. She'd gotten it out when she heard the horse, quietly, without rushing, and she laid the judge's letter and the clause language side by side in front of him. "The clause reads non-familial by blood or marriage," she said. She put her finger on the specific language. "By marriage. I am Gideon's legal wife. The marriage is registered with the territorial court and the Church of Record in Cartwell. The land office has already confirmed the filing." She moved the judge's letter to sit directly in front of Silas. "Judge Halbert's confirmation came back 8 days ago." Silas read it. His jaw moved slightly. "The covenant clause was your father's attempt to keep the land in family hands," Beatrice said, and she said it without cruelty, just as a statement of fact, acknowledging the intent behind the document rather than dismissing it. "It does that. The land is in family hands. That's what it was written to do." Silas looked up from the letter. He looked at her. A different kind of looking than he'd done on the train platform. Not dismissal, but something she couldn't quite name. Something closer to actual seeing. It made her slightly uncomfortable, not because it was threatening, but because it was unexpected, and she'd learned to be cautious of unexpected things from Silas. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. She held his gaze. "That would be because you gave me none," she said. "So any amount is an improvement." Silas breathed out. It wasn't quite a laugh. "Fair," he said, in a tone that didn't admit anything more than the word. Gideon had been watching this and staying out of it, because she didn't need him in it, and because he was learning what she could handle and what she wanted handled, and this she wanted herself. He'd understood that when she'd gotten the folder out. This was her argument to make, her ground to hold, and he wasn't going to step in front of it. Silas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. He looked at Gideon. "She runs the accounts," he said. "Not a question." "Among other things," Gideon said. "The lean-to extension," Silas said. "That's new." "November," Gideon said. "Her idea." Silas looked at the table for a moment, and something shifted in his face that was harder to watch than the hostility had been, because it was more human. It was the face of a man doing a calculation he didn't like the result of. "I need to tell you something," Silas said. He said it to Gideon, then seemed to decide it needed to include her and looked up to take in both of them. "The agency. When I walked away from the platform, I wrote to them. I told them the arrangement had fallen through because the woman presented was—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee. "I used some language I don't need to repeat." Beatrice said nothing. Gideon said nothing. "They wrote back," Silas said, "last month. They said the woman in question had already entered into another arrangement with a member of the same family. They said they'd received reports that the arrangement was—" He stopped again. The word they used was thriving. "Where'd they get that from?" Gideon said. Silas looked slightly uncomfortable. "Dalrymple. Apparently he corresponds with his cousin in Denver, and his cousin's wife knows someone connected to the agency, and he shook his head. Small territory, small world. Thriving, Beatrice repeated. She said the word without any particular expression, just letting it sit on the table between all three of them. Silas looked at her. I came to... He stopped a third time, and this stopping was different from the other ones because it was genuine, because he was running up against something he didn't have a prepared speech for. I made a judgment on that platform that was about what I thought I deserved and not about who you were. I've been... He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I'm not going to tell you it was anything other than what it was. Beatrice waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. No, she said. You're not. She said it levelly, without the anger she had every right to, but without release of it either. It would have been false to release it entirely, and she wasn't built for false things. The question isn't whether you know what you did. The question is what you plan to do about the land office matter going forward, the letters, whether you intend to continue sending them. Silas looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I don't. Because you've been told they won't work, she said, or because you've decided they're wrong. It was a pointed question, and she'd meant it to be, and Silas knew it. He was quiet for long enough that she had time to read something in his face, something tired, something that might have been the beginning of an honest accounting with himself, though she wasn't going to hold her breath for the conclusion. Both, he said finally, if I'm being straight. Both is better than one, Gideon said. It was the first thing he'd said in several minutes, and he said it simply, without forgiveness and without its opposite, just as an observation. Silas stayed for another hour. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't meant to be, and nobody pretended otherwise, but it was real, which was something. He walked around the yard before he left, the way he'd looked around the inside, and he stopped at the wood stacks and stood there for a moment saying nothing. And Beatrice, who was watching from the porch, had the impression he was saying something to himself that he wasn't ready to say out loud. He came back to the porch steps and looked up at Gideon, who'd come out to stand beside her. The northwest corner of the roof, he said. I can see from here the beam configuration is different. We re-supported it during the blizzard, Gideon said. Silas looked at Beatrice. In the blizzard? Before it got worse, she said. He looked at her for a moment with that complicated expression she still couldn't fully name. That was the worst blizzard the high country's had in 6 years, he said. I know, she said. We were in it. Silas nodded once. He went to his horse and untied the rein and mounted with the automatic ease of a man who had ridden his whole life. He looked down at them from the saddle. The property line on the East Ridge, he said to Gideon. There's a survey dispute I've been having with the Halbert Ranch going back to Father's time. It'll affect your eastern trap line if it goes the wrong way. You should get involved in it before spring. I will, Gideon said. Send me the survey map when you found it. I'll add my account of the original boundary. All right. Silas looked at Beatrice one more time. There was something he was trying to say that he didn't have the language for yet, and she could see him trying for it and not finding it, and she didn't help him find it because it needed to be his word when it came, not something she'd handed him. You've done well here, he said finally. Both of you. It wasn't enough. They both knew that, but it was more than he'd been capable of on the platform in October. And the distance between those two things was real, even if the distance left to cover was also real. He rode down the trail, and they stood on the porch and watched until the gray mare disappeared into the trees. Gideon exhaled slowly. That's not finished, he said. No, she agreed. But it's different. Different something. Different something, she said. They went back inside and Beatrice cleared the coffee cups and Gideon built the fire up, and neither of them said much for a while because the visit had used up a kind of energy that needed time to replenish. She washed the cups at the dry sink. He sat at the table with the property survey map he'd dug out 2 days ago on a hunch, the same hunch that had made him locate it without knowing exactly why he was looking for it, and which had now revealed itself as the right hunch, because Silas had just told him he needed it. The East Ridge survey, he said. He's right. I've been ignoring it. Who's been involved in the dispute? She asked, drying the cups. Mostly my father and old Halbert, before they both died. Cord's uncle inherited the dispute with the land. It's been sitting for 3 years. Do you have the original survey document? I have my father's copy. Whether it's the original filing, I'm not sure. I'll write to the Territorial Survey Office in Cheyenne, she said. We should have the filed copy, not the working copy. They're often different. She set the dried cups on the shelf. And we should talk to Cord. He knows that land and he's not his uncle. He might tell us things the older man wouldn't. He looked at her. How do you always know the next thing to do? She turned from the shelf. I don't, she said. I'm 2 steps ahead on this because I've been thinking about it since Halbert's letter mentioned the boundary. I'm not 2 steps ahead on most things. You're 1 step ahead on everything, he said. That's different from knowing the next thing. She looked at him across the room. The afternoon light was going, the short December days collapsing fast toward dark, and the lamp on the table was the main light in the room, and it was between them and both of them were in it. Gideon, she said. Yeah. What you said to Silas, on the platform, when you offered to marry me. He waited. You said you needed a partner more than most things. She looked at him steadily. Is that still true? Now that you have one? He thought about it the way he thought about most things, honestly, without decoration, letting the real answer surface. It's less urgent, he said, because we've solved the immediate problem. He paused. But it's more true, because I found out what it is to actually have one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to tell you something. All right. When I came off that train, I was not looking to be saved. I want you to understand that. She held his eyes. I was looking for a place where what I am would be sufficient, where it would be enough. She paused. Most of my life, in most rooms, I have been too much of some things and not enough of others. Too large, too direct, too... She stopped and found the right word. Too present. People don't always know what to do with someone who takes up the space they actually need. I know what to do with it, he said. I know you do, she said. That's what I'm telling you. It landed between them clean and clear, without performance or softening. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he held hers, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the mountain was dark and cold and completely indifferent to the 2 people inside the cabin finding out what they'd built. He got up from the table. He crossed to the dry sink where she was still standing, and he stopped close enough that she would have had to step back if she'd wanted distance, and she didn't step back. I should tell you something too, he said. All right, she said. I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement sometime in November, he said. I don't know exactly when. It wasn't a decision, it was something that had already happened by the time I noticed it. He looked at her. I don't know what to do with that, except say it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, like someone doing something they have decided to do rather than something that happened to them, she put her hand against his face, just her palm, against his jaw, where the cold of the day was still in his skin. I stopped thinking of it as an arrangement in November too, she said. I don't know when exactly either. He put his hand over hers. Not pulling, not pushing, just there. We're going to have to figure out what it is instead, he said. We'll figure it out, she said. We're reasonably good at that. He almost smiled, and this time it got all the way there. It arrived on his face like something returning from a long absence, a little rusty, a little unsure of itself, but real. She looked at it for a moment with her own expression doing something similar, that almost smile that had been approaching full for weeks, and this time it arrived too. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did, being enormous and cold and entirely itself. And inside the cabin, the fire was burning well, and the beam in the northwest corner was holding, and the stove was drawing clean, and the 2 people who had built all of it stood in the lamplight holding each other's faces in their hands. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but with the particular honesty of people who had stopped pretending they were less than what they were. They didn't talk about what had happened that evening for several days, not because either of them was avoiding it, but because they were both people who needed time to let something real settle before they tested its weight. That was another way they were alike, and Beatrice was still finding new ones. What changed was quieter than what it replaced. He sat closer at the table. She stopped waiting until he was done with the lamp before she opened the book she'd found on his shelf, a battered history of the Louisiana Territory that her father would have loved, and just read beside him while he worked the trap equipment. They didn't perform the change for each other. It was just the distance between them adjusting to something more accurate, the way a measuring cord adjusts when you move it to the thing it's actually measuring. December moved through its short, cold days and gave way to January, and January in the high country was a different animal than December, harder, and more deliberate. The cold no longer making a point but simply being what it was, permanent and factual, and requiring daily management rather than dramatic response. Beatrice had found her footing in it by now. She knew how long the stove needed to heat the room to a workable temperature after the overnight banking. She knew which trail sections iced first after a light snow and which could be trusted. She knew Fletcher's mood by his ears and his breathing, and she knew which of his moods meant something and which didn't. She knew the root cellar's contents by location without looking. She knew the specific groan of the northwest corner rafter on a cold night. Not alarmed now, just talking, the way old structures talk to themselves in the cold. And she knew it was a different sound from the sound that meant trouble. She knew the particular quality of Gideon's silence when he was thinking versus when he was just being quiet, which was a finer distinction than it sounded, and had taken her until December to reliably make. January brought a letter from Harriet in Columbus. It arrived in a packet with 2 other pieces of mail that Cord brought up on one of his Tuesday runs, and Beatrice read it at the table while Gideon was on the roof, a precaution after a heavy 3-day snowfall, the kind of thing he now did reflexively, checking load levels before they became problems instead of after. She could hear him moving above her, steady and methodical, the scrape of the roof rake in its familiar rhythm. Harriet wrote that she was glad to hear Beatrice was well, that she'd told several people about Beatrice's situation, and that the responses had ranged from concerned to incredulous to, in one case, outright envious, which had surprised Harriet considerably. She wrote that the dry goods merchant had hired a new accountswoman who was not as good as Beatrice, and that he'd mentioned this to Harriet with an expression of genuine regret, and Harriet thought Beatrice would want to know that. She wrote, "You described the root cellar and the baffle plate. And I confess I don't know precisely what either of those things are, but you described them with a particular kind of satisfaction that I only ever saw from you once before, when you finished your father's accounts in the year of his second illness and got them exactly right. It seems like you have found the kind of work that makes you that kind of satisfied. I think that matters more than most people admit." Beatrice folded the letter and held it for a moment. Outside, the roof rake kept going. She looked at the stove, drawing clean, at the full shelves, at the folder on the corner of the shelf that held the land office correspondence, now complete and filed and no longer requiring daily attention. At the survey map she'd begun cross-referencing against the original territorial filing she'd written away for, which had arrived from Cheyenne 2 weeks ago and which she'd been annotating in the evenings. She heard Gideon come off the roof, the particular sequence of sounds she knew, the thump of boots on the ladder rungs, the brief pause on the porch. And then the door opened and he came in with cold air and snow on his coat and the specific alertness in his eyes that meant the roof had been fine, because when it wasn't fine, the alertness was different. "How's the north section?" she asked. "Clear," he said. "South overhang has a slight buildup at the edge, but it'll drop on its own when the afternoon sun hits it." He hung up his coat. "Letter from Ohio?" "Harriet," she said. "She says the merchant misses my accounts." "His loss," Gideon said, with the simplicity of a man who considered the matter entirely settled. She smiled. It was a full smile. She didn't track them anymore, didn't count them the way she had in October, but she was aware this was one. "I've been looking at the Cheyenne survey document again," she said. "I think I found the discrepancy Silas mentioned. The original boundary marker on the East Ridge is recorded as a specific rock formation. The survey calls it a granite outcrop with 2 distinct vertical faces. The Halbert family's claim references a different marker, a pine tree, which is noted in their filing as being adjacent to the outcrop." Gideon came to the table and looked at her notation on the map. "The pine wouldn't survive 30 years, he said. "They grow and shift and die up here. You can't stake a permanent boundary on a tree." "Right," she said, "but the granite outcrop would still be there. The question is whether anyone has gone up to physically confirm the granite matches the survey description." She looked at him. "Has anyone?" "Not since the original survey," he said, "which was in 1847. "Then that's the answer," she said. "We go up in spring and document the outcrop against the survey description. If it matches, and it will, granite doesn't change. Then your boundary is the rock formation, not the tree, and the Halbert claim loses its reference point." She sat back. "It's not hostile, it's just accurate. And accuracy is what the land office is going to want when this goes to a formal hearing, which it eventually will." He was looking at her with that look he had, The one that had taken her a while to understand was not simply attention, but something with more weight in it, something that was genuinely trying to see her clearly. "You're already thinking about the hearing," he said. "You should be too," she said. "Silas was right to flag it. The Halbert Ranch has more resources than we do. If they decide to push the dispute formally, they'll have a lawyer in from Cheyenne, and we'll need our documentation complete before that happens, not after." "When did you decide to become a land rights expert?" he said, and there was something almost warm in his voice when he said it, something that was not quite teasing but was in that neighborhood. "I'm not," she said. "I'm a woman who reads documents carefully and doesn't stop in the middle." She picked up Harriet's letter and set it on the shelf with the others she kept. "Those are the same skills. The documents are just different." He sat down across from her. Not across. Beside her now, which was where he sat, and he pulled the survey map toward him and looked at her annotations. His handwriting was plain and large, the handwriting of a man who wrote rarely and practically. Hers was smaller and more precise, and they were threaded through the same map now, his labels and her cross-references, and it looked exactly like what it was. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I went to see Silas 2 weeks ago," he said, "when you thought I was on the North Trap Line." She was still. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know how it was going to go," he said, "and I didn't want to put something in your head before I knew what it was." She considered this. "That's not entirely fair," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. I'm sorry." He said it plainly, without excess. He wasn't a man who apologized elaborately, but he meant it when he did. "I went because I wanted to have the conversation without you in it. Not because you can't handle it, because it was between him and me, and it needed to be said without an audience, even a good one." She held his eyes for a moment. She wanted to be more annoyed by this than she was, but she understood it, because she was also a person who sometimes needed to handle things alone before she brought them to the shared space. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him the letters were done," he said. "That if another one arrived, I'd come down to his property personally, and the conversation we'd have there wouldn't be the kind you could make legal arguments over." He paused. "I said it once, clearly, and then I didn't say anything else about it." "What did he say?" "He said they were already done, that he'd made his decision." Gideon looked at the map. "He also said, and I want you to know this because you deserve to know it, he said he'd been thinking about the platform, about what he did. He didn't frame it as an apology exactly, more like an admission. He said, 'I made a judgment that morning that was about my vanity and nothing else. I know what that was.'" Beatrice sat with this. "That's more than I expected from him," she said. "More than I expected too," Gideon said. "I'm not sure what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," she said. "It's his to carry. Whether he carries it honestly or puts it down and forgets it, that's his." She paused. "But it's better than the alternative." "Yes," he said. "It is." They sat with it for a moment, the shared acknowledgement of a complicated thing that wasn't resolved but was at least clearer. Outside, the January light was going thin and golden, the way it did on clear days. The sun low and the shadows long across the snow, and through the south window the upper peaks were lit with it, orange and rose and a particular shade of cold blue that Beatrice had learned to love, not because it was beautiful in a way that made her sentimental about it, but because it meant clear weather and the specific quality of silence that came after the storm had passed, and the mountain had gone back to just being what it was. February was the month that almost broke them, and not because of the mountain. It started with the news from Cheyenne, not the survey response, which had already arrived and which was useful, but a second letter from a different office, which said that the Territorial Land Authority had received a formal challenge to the Ashcroft Mountain parcel filing, citing a third-party claim of prior use rights stretching back to 1859. The challenge named a man called Darden Cross, who held a timber company operation out of Laramie, and who claimed that his predecessor company had held cutting rights on the upper timber sections of the mountain parcel before the Ashcroft land purchase, rights that had allegedly lapsed through administrative oversight rather than legal termination. Gideon read the letter 3 times. Beatrice read it twice and set it down and looked at the ceiling and breathed through her nose for a moment. "Darden Cross," she said. "I've heard the name," Gideon said. "He's a buyer. Not a cutter himself, he contracts the cutting and takes the profit. He's been working the territory for 12 years. And your father bought this land when? 1861, he said, 2 years after Cross's claimed cutting rights supposedly began. So if his claim is valid, she said, your father may have purchased land that already had an encumbrance on it, which might not have been properly disclosed by the seller. Who was a man named Pardee who moved to California in 1863, Gideon said, and as far as I know is either dead or unreachable. Right, she said. So we can't go after the original seller, which leaves us with either disproving the cutting rights claim or proving they were properly terminated before the sale. She looked at the letter. Who handles timber rights filings for the territory? Same territorial land authority that just wrote to us, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. They had the same thought at the same moment, which was that this was designed, not the original cutting rights necessarily, but the challenge, the timing of it, coming in the same season as Silas's covenant letter, which could have been coincidence or could have been something a man like Darden Cross had been watching, and had chosen to move on when the property seemed under dispute and therefore potentially vulnerable. He waited to see if Silas would destabilize the holding, Beatrice said. And when the land office confirmation came back clean, he filed anyway. Because clean or not, an active dispute creates noise in the record. And noise in the record is what he needs, Gideon said. He doesn't have to win, he just has to make it look complicated long enough to put pressure on. Pressure to settle, she said. Or pressure to sell, he said. She stood up. She went to the shelf where the Cheyenne survey document was and pulled it out, and she set it on the table beside the cross letter, and she sat back down and looked at both of them. He watched her think. He'd learned that her thinking had a visible quality, not that she moved or gestured, but that her eyes did something, a specific pattern of focus and refocus, and he'd learned not to interrupt it. The 1859 cutting rights, she said. If they were real, they'd be in the territorial filing, but if they were administrative rather than purchased, if they were a permit rather than a deed, then they'd have an expiration provision. Permits didn't run indefinitely. They required renewal. She looked at him. If Cross's predecessor didn't renew before the Ashcroft purchase in 1861, the rights lapsed clean. And if they lapsed clean, his claim has no basis. Can we get the original permit filing from the territory? We can request it, she said, the same way we requested the survey document. It'll take 4 to 6 weeks. She picked up the cross letter again. How long do we have before we need to respond to the challenge? The letter says 60 days, he said. Then we have time, she said. But we write to the territory this week, and I'd like to talk to Judge Halbert in person, not by letter. I want him to look at the Cross letter and tell us if he's ever seen this claim before. Halbert might know Cross directly, Gideon said. Small territory. That's what I'm counting on, she said. The trip down to Cartwell in February was harder than the October and November trips had been, because the trail was not the trail anymore. It was a managed corridor through 4 months of accumulated snowpack, and getting a horse down it required more care than riding normally did. They went together not because the trip required 2 people, but because they'd started going into town together in December. And it had become the natural arrangement, the way most of their arrangements became natural by simply being repeated. Judge Halbert received them in his office on a Wednesday morning. He was a careful man by nature, and careful men aged well in the territory because they didn't get ahead of their information, and he had the unhurried manner of someone who'd been practicing that particular discipline for a long time. He read the cross letter without commenting, turned it over, read the back, which was blank, and set it down. Darden Cross, he said. You know him, Beatrice said. I've seen his name in 2 previous filings in this territory, Halbert said. In both cases, he filed a prior use claim against a property that was in some kind of active dispute. In the first case, the owners settled rather than fight it. They were elderly and didn't have the energy for it. In the second case, the territorial authority ruled against him, but it took 18 months. He looked at them both. He's doing the same thing here. He's not confident in the underlying claim. He's confident in the process. Do you believe the cutting rights existed? Beatrice asked. I believe his predecessor company may have held a provisional cutting permit in 1859, Halbert said carefully. Those permits were issued by the territorial governor's office in that period, and they had a standard 18-month term with a required renewal. If the renewal wasn't filed before your father's purchase, they're void. He looked at Gideon. Do you know when your father completed the purchase? The exact date. March of 1861, Gideon said. The 14th. Halbert nodded slowly. Then you need the permit record and the renewal record, if one exists. If the permit was issued in 1859 and had an 18-month term, the renewal would have been due by mid-1860 at the latest. If it wasn't filed by March 14th of 1861, you win on the timeline alone. We've already written to the territory for the permit record, Beatrice said. It should arrive within 6 weeks. Halbert looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who was recalibrating something, though he'd been recalibrating it since December, each time they came in. He'd told Gideon, on a day when Beatrice was at Dalrymple's, that he thought Gideon had made the best decision of his life on that train platform, and Gideon had said that wasn't something he'd argue with. Mrs. Ashcroft, Halbert said, would you be willing to prepare the formal response to the challenge? I can review it and file it under my signature as a courtesy, which gives it more standing than a self-represented response. She looked at him. I'm not a lawyer. No, he said, but the response itself just needs to be accurate and properly cited. The law doesn't require a lawyer to write it. It requires a lawyer to stand behind it. He looked at his desk. I'll stand behind yours. She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed through her face. Not pride, which would have been too simple, but something close to the satisfaction she'd described to Harriet. The recognition of being seen for what she actually was. All right, she said, give me 2 weeks. The document she produced was 14 pages. She wrote it at the table in the evenings, working by lamplight after supper while Gideon read or worked equipment beside her, and she wrote it and rewrote it and cut it and added back what was necessary and cut more. She cited the land authority's own precedent from the ruling Halbert had mentioned, the second cross case, and she built the argument from the timeline outward, the permit's likely expiration date being the load-bearing center of everything else. She was not certain of the permit record yet. It hadn't arrived from Cheyenne, but she wrote the argument so that it stood on its own logic until the record arrived to confirm it, and so that when the record arrived, it would slot into the existing structure without requiring a rewrite. Gideon read it when it was done. He read all 14 pages at the table one evening while she was in the loft, and when she came down in the morning, the document was on the table with a piece of firewood on it to keep it flat, and at the top he'd written 2 words in his large plain hand. It's right. She looked at those 2 words for a moment. She drank her coffee. She realized the particular kind of tired that came after doing something difficult correctly, which was a different kind of tired from every other kind, cleaner, with less left over. The permit record arrived from Cheyenne in the last week of February. It confirmed that a provisional timber cutting permit had been issued to a company called Meridian Timber in August of 1859, with an 18-month term and a required renewal no later than February of 1861. No renewal was on record. The permit had lapsed 6 weeks before Gideon's father had completed his purchase. The timeline was clean. Cross's claim had no foundation. Beatrice added the permit record as an exhibit to the response document and sent it to Halbert. Halbert filed it with the Territorial Land Authority in the first week of March. The authority's preliminary response came back 3 weeks later. The cross challenge was under review and would require a formal hearing, but the authority noted that the timeline evidence was significant and suggested the parties might consider whether the challenge warranted the cost of a full proceeding, which was the authority's way of telling Darden Cross he was going to lose and should consider whether he wanted to lose publicly or quietly. He chose quietly. His withdrawal letter arrived in mid-April, 14 months after Beatrice had stepped off a train in Cartwell and stood on a platform holding her bag with both hands. She read it sitting on the porch in the first real warmth of spring. The snow retreated to the upper ridges, the yard mud-soft and smelling of thaw. Gideon was in the lean-to doing something to the saddle that had needed doing since winter. She read the letter and sat with it for a moment and then set it on her knee and looked at the mountains. She'd looked at these mountains from this porch a great many times since October, and her relationship with them had changed in the way your relationship changes with anything you've lived inside of. They were no longer a backdrop or a setting. They were a fact she inhabited, the way her own body was a fact she inhabited, with all its complications and requirements, and the ongoing work of maintaining it. She no longer thought of them as beautiful the way she might have from a train window. They were too real for that now, too specific. She knew which ridge held the east property line. She knew which draws were elk trails. She knew where the granite outcrop was that the 1847 survey had used as a boundary marker and which she and Gideon had confirmed in person 2 weeks ago, climbing up together through the last of the spring mud to stand beside a rock formation, exactly as described in a 70-year-old document, its two vertical faces clean and obvious and unmovable. She'd put her hand on the granite and stood there for a moment, not saying anything, and Gideon had stood beside her not saying anything either, and it had been one of the best moments she could remember. Not because it was the resolution of the East Ridge dispute, though it was, but because of what it meant to stand beside a rock that had been standing there longer than anyone alive could account for, having walked to it through land you'd spent a winter earning, with a person you'd earned it with. She'd thought about her father then, about his voice reading out loud, about the way he'd go quiet when something had gotten to him. She thought he would have stood beside that rock and gone quiet, and then he'd have said something understated and accurate about it, and she'd have known what he meant. "Well," she said out loud, to no one, sitting on the porch with Cross's withdrawal letter on her knee. "I see why you stayed." Gideon came out of the lean-to with the saddle over his arm and looked at her. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "Come read this." He came up to the porch and she handed him the letter and he read it standing up, which was how he read things. He'd never broken the habit of standing to read, like sitting meant you were committing too much time to it. He read it and handed it back. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. He sat down beside her. Not across. The bench was wide enough and they'd learned its dimensions by now. He was quiet for a moment looking at the mountains, and she was quiet beside him, and the spring was making itself known in the yard, the mud, the new color in the willow along the south edge, the sound of the creek running high with snowmelt. "I want to put it in a kitchen garden," she said, "on the south side where the light runs long in the afternoon. If we break ground in the next 2 weeks, we can get the beds prepared before the last frost." "What are you thinking for crops?" "Root vegetables for storage. Kale. Some greens for summer." She looked at the south wall. "I'd like to try squash if we have a long enough season. I know we're high." "We've had enough growing days for squash in the good years," he said. "Not every year, but enough." "Then we'll try," she said. He nodded. She could feel him looking at her the way he looked at her when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. "I want to add a proper room onto the back," he said. "A real bedroom, off the north wall, not a loft." She looked at him. He looked at the north wall of the cabin and not at her, which was how he handled the things that had the most weight. He said them looking somewhere else. "A bedroom," she said. "For us," he said. If you want." He was still looking at the north wall. "We don't have to rush it, but I want to build it this summer. I want to have it before next winter." She looked at his profile. She looked at the north wall. She thought about the loft, which she'd climbed to every night since October, and the bedroll on the floor below, and the long distance between the two of them that had been practical and appropriate, and which had also become, by some point she couldn't identify exactly, a distance that was no longer accurate. "Yes," she said. "I want that." He looked at her then. Just looked at her, with all the looking he'd been doing since October, and she looked back, and between them was the full weight of everything they'd built, which was considerable and imperfect and ongoing and exactly what it was. They sat with it for a while. The spring moved around them. Then she said, "The south garden first. We have a window." "The south garden first," he agreed. They got up. They went to different tasks. She to sketch out the garden beds on paper, he to find the spade and the garden fork they hadn't used since the year before. And the work began again, the way it always did, not with ceremony, but with the next necessary thing. Here's what she understood by April that she hadn't understood in October. Strength is not the same as stubbornness, though they can look identical from the outside. Strength is what lets you stay open when everything in you wants to close. What lets you take a practical arrangement at face value and build something real inside it. What lets you carry your own weight without performing the carrying, which is harder than it sounds because the performance is often the only thing people see and reward. She'd spent most of her life being told in various ways that she was too much, too big, too direct, too practical, too present. And she'd spent most of her life trying to solve that problem for other people, making herself smaller, choosing the photograph that was 3 years old, describing herself as stout rather than what she was, which was solid and strong and constitutionally suited to exactly the kind of life she was now living. She didn't think she'd solved anything. She thought she'd found the place where the problem wasn't a problem. which was different from solving it and probably better, because solutions had a way of coming undone, but the right place, the place where who you actually are is exactly what's needed, that had a different kind of staying power. Gideon came around the corner of the cabin with the spade, and she was already pacing out the south bed by stepping it off, her work boots pressing even marks in the mud. He watched her for a moment before she noticed him, and on his face was the expression she'd come to know, the one that was trying to see her clearly and kept finding more than it expected. "You're starting from the south wall?" he asked. "The light hits the south wall first," she said, "and the wall will hold some heat overnight in the early season. Better germination." He nodded. He set the spade at the line she'd marked. "Here?" "6 inches further west," she said. "I want to leave room to walk between the wall and the first bed." He moved the spade. "Here?" "There," she said. He drove it in. The earth was cold and wet and real, and it gave. They built the south garden in the second week of April. They built the bedroom addition through June and July, Gideon doing the heavy framing and Beatrice doing the finish work she was better at, the window fitting, the door hang, the interior plastering with a mix she researched and made herself because the local supply was wrong for the climate. The room was not large and it was not fancy, and the window faced east so it caught the morning light, which Beatrice had asked for specifically because she liked knowing, when she woke, where the day was starting from. In August, Silas rode up the trail with 2 days' notice and a letter that was not a legal argument but an ordinary letter, the kind a brother writes to a brother when he has run out of other ways to say something and has settled on saying it plain. He asked if he could come and see the place, not to assess it, just to see it. Gideon showed him the East Ridge granite outcrop. Beatrice showed him the garden, which had come in better than she'd hoped. The squash had made it, which she was quietly satisfied about. Silas walked around the yard and looked at everything with the particular quiet of a man who had been building a case against something, and has arrived to find the case won't stand. He stayed one night. He slept on the main room floor. The loft was storage now, the old bedroll replaced by the room off the north wall. And in the morning he sat at the table with his coffee, and he said to Beatrice without preamble, "I treated you as a category and not a person. I've thought about it enough to know that's the accurate description." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." "I don't expect anything for saying it," he said. "I'm not asking for something." "I know," she said. "That's why it counts." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't the erasure of what had happened on that platform, and none of the three of them mistook it for either of those things, because they were all, in their different ways, people who preferred accuracy to comfort. It was what it was. A man looking at his own behavior without blinking and naming it, which was not nothing. In fact, it was one of the harder things a person could do, and Beatrice had lived long enough to know how rare it was. Silas rode out after breakfast. He looked back once from the edge of the tree line, just looked, at the cabin, at the yard, at the two people standing on the porch, and then he kept riding, and they watched him go. And they didn't know precisely what came next with him, and neither of them pretended to. What they knew was what was behind them, and it was considerable. One winter, one blizzard, one crawl space in the dark, 2 legal challenges, a 14-page response document, and a granite outcrop that had been standing for centuries before any of them arrived, and would be standing for centuries after. A root cellar rebuilt, a baffle plate replaced, a beam seated in the cold and dark at 3 in the morning by 2 people who had not known each other 6 weeks prior, and who had, in the doing of it, become something that neither of them had a clean word for, and neither of them needed one. What you build in a hard season with the right person is not the same as what you build in easy weather with someone agreeable. It's not prettier, it's often not comfortable, but it holds in ways that other things don't, and you know it holds because you've already seen it tested, already heard it groan under the worst load and stay. Beatrice stood on the porch in the August morning and felt the sun on her face and thought about Ohio and the dry goods merchant and the train platform and the one-way ticket and all the things she'd sold that hadn't been worth keeping, and she thought about the things she'd found on this mountain that she hadn't known she was looking for, not because she'd arrived looking, but because she'd arrived willing, which was the only way anything real ever started. She had stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. Not in a single moment of resolution, not in a declaration, but in the way things actually changed, incrementally, practically, in the middle of hard work, one morning at a time until the morning came when she simply noticed she'd stopped. That was how it happened. That was how most true things happened. Gideon came and stood beside her. He handed her coffee without being asked, because that was still how it worked in the morning and would be for a long time. The north fence line needs checking before September, he said. This week or next? She asked. This week, before the elk move. She nodded. She drank her coffee. The mountains were doing what the mountains did, being enormous and specific and entirely themselves. And the garden was growing, and the room faced east, and the granite outcrop was exactly where the survey said it was. And they stood there together in the particular quiet of two people who had nothing left to prove to each other and a great deal of work still to do. That was enough. That was, she had learned, exactly enough.